We've got Dr. Naomi Rose, who is the Marine Mammals Animal Welfare Institute, and also just a secondary thank you to Naomi and her organization because they were one of the monetary contributors to put this program on, so we're really appreciative for that.
Welcome. Thanks, Katie. That was just a great talk, and some of that is covered. You are just all a black blob. That is a very harsh light. There is a chapter in The Case Against Marine Mammals in Captivity about the blackfish legacy, the blackfish effect, and some of what Katie talked about is covered in there, but we just learned a whole bunch of new stuff, so wait for the 7th edition. So this is the 6th edition. How many of you, not that I can see you, but how many of you have read The Case Against Marine Mammals in Captivity? Yeah, it's meant for you. It's meant as a handbook, a white paper, a Bible, if you will, to the advocates, activists, students, policymakers, scientists who want to know more about this issue. The main text is meant for the average reader who just is interested but not academically going to dive right in. And then the endnotes, which are more than half a document, get into the meat of the matter, as it were. I'm a vegetarian, but gets into the substance of the matter. All of the references are in the endnotes. There are no references in the main text. We just kept that at a somewhat higher level. So if you think that the document doesn't cover something after you read the main text, it almost certainly does in the endnotes, but it might be in an odd place because we were somewhat inspired by a particular example, for example, and so it would end up in an endnote in a chapter that you might not think it belongs in, but there's a connection. So do a search. It is, of course, a PDF. And do a search on the topic, and you might find language in the document that actually covers that in the endnotes. The 5th edition came out in 2019. The 4th edition came out in 2009. What happened in between? We got knocked off course. We should have come out with a 5th edition in something like 2013. What happened in 2013? So we were just too busy actually doing the work, fighting the fight, working on the campaign to do this. And it is an incredibly intensive job to do this. And I have pretty much been doing nothing but this, including proofing the galleys, which drives you slowly insane, for the last 4 or 5 months. And months before that, my husband, Chris, who's my co-author, was working on it. He's actually writes all the new stuff, and then I'm his editor, but I also put in some information that he doesn't necessarily work with every day. So I am the primary author, but Chris is definitely an equal partner in this. And it is co-published by my organization, the Animal Welfare Institute, but also World Animal Protection, because they help out financially. And that gets us some hard copies and also translations. And as you may know, the 5th edition was translated into French, Spanish, Japanese, Chinese, and Russian. And this time around, we're also translating it into Arabic, because, of course, the Middle East is another hot spot for these facilities expanding. The Chinese edition is obviously very timely. The Russian edition is not as necessary anymore, but you never know because they change their policies relatively quickly. So that 10-year break between the 4th and 5th edition was not intentional. It was just life took over, or in a sense, death took over. And we were, we only got back to it in about 2018, late 2018. We said we really need to do a new edition, and it was vastly expanded from the 4th edition. This edition is not as vastly expanded from the 5th edition as you might imagine, because it's only been 4 years, but there's been a lot of things that have happened, both good and bad, in that 4 years. And so we tried to update it with all of that new information, as well as dive into some things from the past that we hadn't covered as thoroughly the last time, because we weren't facing an industry that is desperately trying to remain relevant societally, right? So let's see if I can do this. So again, this 10-year gap was because of the death of Dawn Brancho and everything that happened after that. As you may or may not be aware, I was kind of involved in all of that. And so we just were subsumed by events. And we had to address those events. And we did. And we cover a lot of that in the 5th edition. So that is, you will have already seen that. But this edition has only got 4 years since, and so it's not quite as broadly expanded. What people doing it behind their back? That's amazing. I personally believe that one of the reasons for the Blackfish effect, one of the reasons the film was so effective, because personally, without this, I'm not really sure why it was so effective. Katie may have a better answer to that question because, she studies these societal impacts, and that's not my forte. But, it's a good documentary. But so was The Cove. The Cove won the Academy Award, and it didn't have that impact. So what was it about Blackfish that was just so effective? And I personally think it had a lot to do with Free Willy. Yes. Right? I don't know how many of you are, okay, let's do it this way. How many of you are in your early 30s? Late 20s, early 30s, maybe mid 30s? Not too many. But maybe you're not willing to admit it. Anyway, how many, let me put it to you this way. How many of you saw Free Willy when you were below 15? Ah, many more. All right. So you saw Free Willy when you were younger than 15 years old. And now you're all having children, eh? No, I don't have any kids, so I'm not passing any judgment. But a lot of those people who saw Free Willy as children are now adults, maybe having children. And I think they're just they were primed for Blackfish. They were primed. It was not just a perfect storm. It was a perfect storm of many years building. And I'm not sure, it's just an interesting academic question. Would Blackfish have had the impact it had if Free Willy hadn't come first? It's a thought experiment, because we will never know, of course. But I think, personally, that it was a factor. So what's new in the 6th edition? Again, remember, we've only got 4 years of new information, not 10, the way we did with the 5th edition. The big thing is, as I pointed out, the industry is trying to remain relevant. It isn't any secret to them that we're winning, right? And I say that from a 30-year perspective. So if some of you feel that we're not winning, we are. Yes, we can't rest on our laurels. Yes, we have to keep fighting. Yes, the fight is absolutely not over. But if we keep fighting, we can say right now that we're winning. Right? I'm saying that to you as encouragement and just a fact, right? So the industry for the last 5 years or so has not been idle, as we all know. And one of the things they're doing is they're churning out research. They're churning out welfare research. Because prior to about 2017, every welfare paper that was out there, and there weren't many, pointed that out, that there weren't many welfare papers published. All right, and this is welfare of captive marine mammals, right? They just weren't. Why would you study something when you own access to the animals, when you can say yes or no to whoever wants to come in and study them? Why would you allow research that might prove your animals aren't happy, or their welfare is impaired, or you're doing something wrong? They're not going to like that. And they literally were saying no to a lot of the researchers who they felt were too radical or too biased. And they would only allow any work that was done, and it was very rare that they would allow it, with researchers who had already proved themselves to be, as we say now, pro-cap. That was a David Kirby term from Death at SeaWorld. If you're pro-cap in your leanings as an academic, which is, of course, interesting in itself, then they would allow you in if you were asking questions they weren't too worried about. All right? So since the blackfish effect has had such an enormous impact, they have gotten off their tush, and they've really started allowing pretty much every, well, I won't say that. I'm going to take that back. They haven't been allowing everybody in. They have been allowing more work to be done, though. And they're so nervous about it, I think, about what the results might be, that they're very careful about who they let in, actually. But we have discovered that there have been probably as many papers published in the last 5 years as there have ever been published on marine mammal welfare. Welfare research is animal welfare science is an established science, but it's not commonly focused on cetaceans because those animals are worth millions of dollars. All right, so this is the research that we found, and there's more. This is all just notice EG, for example. All right, since 2015, so post Blackfish, all the way through to 2022. And there's actually been a couple of 2023 papers that we found and have cited in the document. And all of this is on cetaceans, not marine mammals generally, polar bears, sea lions. There are papers out there about those animals, but not as many as you should find. But there's a growing body of welfare research. Interestingly enough, a lot of it is biased. Maybe that's not interesting. Maybe that's so obvious you weep. I don't know. So 9 of these papers, which are not listed in here, so this is all of the papers but 9 that we cited. And then we cited 9 more that were in a special issue of PLS 1. What is PLS? That's Public Library of Science. So they have several different journals, and they have PLOS 1, which is meant to get peer-reviewed science, mostly biology, but not entirely, out quickly. And it's all open access. You have to pay as the researcher to get your work published in these journals because they're going to give them away free to all of you. So the industry paid, I'm sure, paid the fee to have this special issue of PLOS published. All right? 9 papers. What was interesting about them was this was clearly a blackfish effect. They didn't do this out of the goodness of their heart or because they realized they needed to do it or anything. They were doing it because they saw the handwriting on the wall and realized they had to start fighting back. Science was science, even if it was bad science, and it is bad science. Okay, so again, this is a slide to illustrate this effort by the industry to remain relevant in today's society. So Katie mentioned this, society's shifting. The societal paradigm, as you've probably heard that phrase before, is shifting. And so the industry is desperately trying to remain relevant. And one of the ways of doing that is this additional research, but also partnering with traditional conservation groups like the IUCN to show or to argue that they can rescue endangered small cetacean species by being Noah's Ark, by taking them into captivity, breeding them there, and then eventually returning them to the wild. And it's reached the point where if you ask some of the folks who are involved in this in the captivity world, so these are the partners with the IUCN, if you ask some of these Alliance of Marine Mammal Parks and Aquariums reps or facility reps or AZA, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums reps, if you ask them, but you've always said they can't be released to the wild. If you keep them in captivity for 10 years, you can't release them to the wild, let alone if they were born there. So what's changed? And they'll backpedal like crazy and they'll say, we never said that. And if you go try to Google it today, you will find all of those statements have been scrubbed. Now, we found a few of them on the way back machine. That's great. Thank you, Ingrid, for teaching me about the way back machine. But it's scrubbed. The cyberspace has been scrubbed of these statements because it doesn't go. It contradicts their ICPC, Integrated Conservation Planning for Cetaceans initiative. The integrated means integrating in situ, which is in the wild, and ex situ, which is in captivity, efforts. That's the integration. So what's right about the work that they've been doing? This is the industry research, but what's right about it? It shows that there are some clear welfare impacts in certain situations. So they couldn't hide from all the truth. They had to publish some facts, some data that showed there were clear welfare impacts. Interestingly enough, which I'll mention later, a lot of this work is being done outside North America. There's considerable room for improving cetacean welfare, and that is one of the things we need to keep in mind, because not all of the currently captive cetaceans are going to find homes in sanctuaries or are going to be rehabilitated and released. Some of them are going to have to, as I've been putting it lately, shelter in place. And we have room for improving their welfare. It'll never be great, but it'll be better than it is right now. And some of this work is showing that. Enrichment should be species, sex, and even individual specific. It has to be tailored, right? It can't just be one size fits all. Not species-wise, not facility-wise, not gender-wise, and not even individual-wise. And that fifth point, which I just mentioned, the helpful research that's really showing that there are stressors and stress reactions. Most of it's being done outside of North America. Bizarrely enough, some of it's being done in China. Because China doesn't really seem to care what the politics of the situation are. We need to figure out how to work with that. What's wrong with this research? And there's a lot of it. There was a very biased approach to the welfare design. And by the way, notice the asterisk is about the cetacean welfare study. The PLOS papers. There's considerable bias in the paper's language. They literally will say in their introduction or their discussion, zoos are integral to conservation. Our partnership with zoos is important. Zoos are committed to conservation. It's filled with rhetorical statements like that that really don't have a place in an academic or scientific journal article. When we put language like that, and not even close to that, in some of the papers we've submitted, we've been called on that. Oh, it's biased. You said zoos are bad, and we didn't even say that. We said zoos have room for improvement or something like that. And then, oh, that's biased. You're clearly anti-zoo. And yet they say that zoos are perfect, zoos are great, zoos are important, and they're not called out on that? What's going on over at PLOS 1, 7 of the 9 papers were what we call, or what my husband found out was called, salami publication or data slicing. In other words, they were 7 papers that should have been 1 paper. This work, which started with 43 facilities across the globe, some of them in Europe, some of them in Japan. So 43 facilities participated in this study, putting data loggers on their dolphins and their belugas, not their orcas, mind you, and collecting data on their daily activity budgets and that sort of thing. That was 3 papers. Behavior, turns out one of the 9 papers, that wasn't one of the remaining 2 papers was on blood parameters, and the last paper was on stress response, stress hormones. So 7 of them were on behavior. That's 1 paper, not 7. You don't just keep slicing the data thinner and thinner and thinner so that you can bulk up your publications. So this wasn't really a special issue. This should have been just published in PLOS 1 as 3 separate papers. But they commandeered an entire special issue to make it look like there was so much research, right? And they had about 3 to 4 years, well, 3, I would say, 3 years of data, and hundreds of hours of biologger data from hundreds of animals, because it was 43 facilities, but it was 1 paper. So it's considered, in some cases, academic malfeasance to salami publish, to salami publish, and they went ahead and did that. And interestingly enough, PLOS 1 actually published one of the papers that indicated that salami publication was academic malfeasance. And then they published an entire special edition that was salami publication. And they didn't ask them the most obvious questions. Are captive dolphins more or less active than wild ones? Do they spend more or less time doing this, doing that, doing the other thing? Isn't that an obvious question? Wouldn't you want to know the answer to that question? I mean, I know the answer to that question, quite frankly, but not systematically, not from a peer-reviewed science point of view. And I still don't have that answer from a peer-reviewed science point of view because I didn't ask it. The whole point was, rather than testing null hypotheses, which is what I just mentioned, the null hypothesis would be captivity does not affect the activity budgets of dolphins. That's the null hypothesis. Then you go out and collect data, biologger data, to test that. Instead of doing that, they actually just assumed everything was great. And they were just collecting some data to show that that is great, which is bad confirmation bias kind of approach. So they were literally assuming, especially with the rhetoric initially and finally, in the introduction and the discussion, that welfare was already good in captivity. In fact, in certain cases, they were implying it was ideal. And then they went out and collected a bunch of data that they assessed from that point of view. And I can bet you dollars to donuts that if they found any data that contradicted that assumption, it didn't get into that PLOS 1 special issue. So they had no recommendations for how to improve welfare, because how can you improve something that's already perfect? The 5 or so, well, actually, I think I found 3. I searched on recommend, and that's all I found. So recommend and recommendation would come up in that search, and literally it was only mentioned 3 times, and they were research recommendations. We need more research on this. We need more research on that. But they weren't recommending anything. For example, they determined that changing enrichment frequently, changing the noodles, the pool noodles that are in the pool, or the balls that they provide them, changing enrichment on a periodic basis, or maybe even not a periodic, but more an intermittent basis, is good. They get bored by the toys you provide them after a while, and if you change it up, it keeps them more engaged. But then they didn't recommend that you do that. They found that, as we all know, they're more active and more normal in their behavior in a larger tank than a smaller tank. That data did come out during the analysis, and that has been published in the past in other studies. But then they did not recommend, hey, we should build bigger tanks. They didn't recommend that. Big problem. And what else is new in the 6th edition? So I'm moving on from chapter 3, the new chapter 3. I'm moving on from that. So this whole thing about why isn't the ICPC a good idea? This is what I was talking about doing a deeper dive into history. We actually looked at all of these species that they are currently, the ICPC is currently thinking about making the focus of their efforts. They are literally talking about, for some of these species, while there's still time, while there's still 3,000 of them instead of just 30 of them, we should go out and start capturing some of them and putting them in captivity and seeing if we can't breed them there so that we can have, what do you call that? A population that will, be there when the rest of them are wiped out in the wild. Yeah. And so, sorry, sometimes my English just goes whoosh right out the window. So I'm getting old, I'm telling you. Yeah. So we looked into the past. They're basically saying, well, let's capture, you may know about the vaquita effort. How many of you know about the vaquita effort? Yeah, they tried to capture some vaquita, the most endangered cetacean in the world. There's probably only about 10 left. Okay, this is an endemic porpoise to the Gulf of California. And they tried to capture some to put them in captivity, to breed them there, and then they were going to release them. And they killed 2 females doing it. Females, not males, which are, no offense, guys, not that important to the population, but females who are the future, right? They're the ones who are going to have the babies. So horrible, horrible mistake. And some of them walked away from that with that lesson learned. Horrible mistake. Some of them didn't. Some of them are doubling down. All right, and so this is what the ICPC is. It's the doubling down on the vaquita, what they call the CPR effort. So they want to go out and, let's just say, capture Ganges River dolphins or capture Atlantic humpback dolphins and try to breed them in captivity. Because there's still 3,000 Atlantic humpback dolphins. So if we kill a few while we're trying to capture them, it's not going to wipe out the whole population the way it did with the vaquita. So we went back and looked into the past to see why are there no why are there no Atlantic humpback dolphins in captivity? Why are there no Ganges River dolphins in captivity? Why are those species not displayed in captivity? It's because they never tried and they just made enough profit with bottlenose dolphins and belugas to not need it? Or was there something else going on there? And there was something else going on there. They actually did try. They tried with a lot of species back in the day, and they killed them all. They killed them all with no successful breeding. So they just gave up. It wasn't commercially viable to keep trying with those species. And they ended up with the species that were hardy enough to live for a few years to make a profit. Now they just want to do the same thing again? Those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it? I mean, I just don't get that. There are updates on tokite. Mystic Aquarium imports, they brought in 5 captive-born beluga whales from Canada, from Marineland. 5 captive-born beluga whales. There are only 3 left. They killed 2. Lots of reasons why they did that. It is all in Kamek, 6th edition. Please read. The Delphinaris Arizona dolphins, those are Delphinaris. This is a really great story from our perspective. It's terrible from the dolphins' perspective. Delphinaris Arizona was a new facility in the United States. We don't, that's a regressive thing, right? We finally had slowed and then stopped the expansion of these facilities in the United States. And then the next thing we know, they're building one in the desert in Arizona. Within 3 years, 2 years and 3/4 of a year, it was closed. Big, stupid hole in the ground. Because 4 of the 8 dolphins that were living there died within a few months of each other. And then they sent the other 4 to Coral World, which is another update we've got in the 6th edition. But we actually saw this incredibly bad idea happen. And it wouldn't have been our doing, it was the animals dying that closed it. And I'm going to be very petty now, very small, and just tell you the satisfaction of being able to say, "Neener, neener, neener, we told you so," was quite gratifying. Some other updates. So there are some updates, but the big changes are the discussion of the new research they put out and these new efforts they're trying to make being Noah's Ark. So if you have any questions, let me know. We are releasing it today officially, so it's up on our website. And we put out social media. If you look at AWI or WAP today, you'll see it. We've asked, we let the media know, so I don't think it's going to be that big of media, but, it is the 10th anniversary of Blackfish and the 30th anniversary of Free Willy, so we use that as the media hook, so who knows? I was literally doing this, proofing the galleys until midnight, a couple of days ago. So, it's been hard for me to get my head out of that space. But any questions?
Dr. Naomi, I'd like to say that, you were talking about they started spitting out science. And I was, I just doing Twitter stories and looking was often, featured. And I noticed when the Free Morgan Foundation and Dr. Ingrid started challenging their commits on scientific or entertainment, all of a sudden Laura Park started spitting out all these little things on a deaf orca or hearing deficient orca. But they had already said she had incorporated calls from the other Laura Park orca into her repertoire. So they were just putting out this bunk science to say they were science researchers and to try to their.
So Hayes is talking about the bunk research, as she called it, Yeah. Well, I'm about to, for all the academics in the audience, my apologies, but I'm about to release a dirty little secret. Peer review isn't that great. Peer review is not the magic wand or the super pill that makes sure all science is strong and objective and blah blah blah. It really isn't that great. It's who agrees to review something, when they agree to review it, and sometimes those people are actually conflicted. They have conflicts of interest and they review it anyway, which is really bad. If there was such a thing as disbarment from science, then they should be disbarred for that. I actually recuse myself. I do not review a lot of Captivity papers because I have a conflict. I'm going to say this science that the science sucks. I'm going to say that because from my point of view, it does, but it's not necessarily an objective point of view. If it's something where I'm pretty sure it's going to be fair and honest about what it reports, I'll review it. But if it is straight out of the mouths of pro-cap scientists, I won't review it. I don't review, Lori will laugh at this, I don't review Jason Bruck papers. Jason Bruck is, that was Diane. Jason Bruck is, if I could have a nemesis, he's my nemesis, all right? And he actually goes out of his way to troll me, and he's an academic, he's a scientist, he works for I won't tell you where he works. So he, if he publishes something, I don't review his papers because I'm gonna say it sucks. I'm not objective, I know that. So what are they doing, allowing, what was it, Lori? The co-editor of the entire journal was a reviewer or something like that for one of our papers? Yeah.
Interesting. Ask me about the journal Animals.
Yeah, journal Animals. Don't submit to that journal. It's a piece of crap. But seriously, they were allowing people to review our papers who had a clear conflict. And that's sorry, I just made a crinkle noise in Karina's ear. I was playing with it and I was going, what is that? Oh, it's the mic. Oh my God. So yeah, it is not the great process that it's made out to be. It actually can be very biased. So papers get published that shouldn't. What you really want is your reviewers to include some people who know your work and some people who don't, but know the issue, and be fair about who you're asking to review your papers. The industry's pro-cap researchers are not terribly fair about that.
So when I worked at a marine park, I noticed that when they brought research in, it was generally I think the researchers thought that they were doing a hearing study or something. But from the marine park, they thought that would be, the way that they were going to get to keep that animal. Like they would kind of bring in that research on purpose for their own good, right?
Right. So the comment was that sometimes the industry allows the research to be done because it's going to make them.
They don't tell them that, right?
Yeah, they don't tell the researchers that, but it'll make them look good. Yes and no. Certainly, there are some researchers who are pretty naive and don't ask why they're being allowed to work with some captive animal. There was a paper that was published on Tillicum's basal metabolic rate, and I don't think the researcher who was involved in that was terribly politically savvy and really didn't care, so he came in and did an honest study. And I'll tell you what it showed. It showed that Tillicum spent 70% of his time doing nothing. There's nothing less natural than that for a killer whale, for an orca. 70% of his time doing nothing. Floating like a log or swimming really, 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 really slowly. And he didn't think anything about that, and he published it honestly, but I don't think he's been invited back. Ingrid.
Yeah, just another comment about the stuff that Naomi's talking about, and I want to reinforce it. Naomi and I were at a conference in Barcelona just before COVID broke out, and there were a couple of presentations there by scientists who are working at Loro Parque, which is a place in Spain that holds orca captive. And when we grilled the presenter, it turns out that he was paid by Loro Parque to do that research.
And that's not normal.
Yeah.
That is not appropriate. You shouldn't accept funding from the party you may be benefiting. So for example, if you're doing noise research, it may seem a no-brainer to go to the Navy for funding, but you really shouldn't. Because the Navy has a big stake in what your results are. And if you're honest with your results, you might never get a dime from the Navy again. That's punitive.
I
they were referring to themselves as zoos. Is that correct?
Generically, zoos, aquariums, and whatever. Yeah, I mean, we call them delphinaria or marine theme parks, you know, yeah.
Yeah, but if they were calling themselves zoos, they wouldn't be having animals perform.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, think about it. This is actually, that's fascinating, Peggy, thank you. Which species that are held in zoos, aquaria, you know, marine theme parks, anything that is not a circus, that doesn't officially call itself a circus, how many species are still performing? Almost none except marine mammals. The bears don't dance anymore, the chimps don't ride tricycles anymore, right? It's only at marine theme parks where they even still have birds performing. I mean, you know, it is not a zoo thing to do anymore, to have your animals perform. It used to be as common as dirt. Zoos always had performing animals, but that hasn't been true since like the 70s, the 80s. Even China stopped zoo performances. They still had dancing bears and tricycle riding chimps up until extremely recently. I think it was 2016 or something like that when they stopped it. So nobody who calls themselves a legitimate zoo would ever do that, except for some strange reason. Dolphins, sea lions, walruses, they still perform in a circus-like format, circus-like tricks, circus-like music, and in China they don't even try to hide it. They're wearing circus MC uniforms, right? So why is that? I have no idea. Well, I do have some ideas, but nothing that I can, you know, prove. Any more questions? Yeah.
So I've gotten into this argument with, you know, pro-caps quite a bit when it comes to research that places like SeaWorld do. I say research loosely. When I was in college, I was taught that if you were going to do like a study on a specific animal, like it had to be, you know, a purebred of that particular animal. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I have said often that the research that SeaWorld does on their orcas, you know, minus the ones that are 100% Icelandic, is essentially null and void because those animals are hybrid. You can't go on and say, oh yeah, southern residents are like this because, you know, SeaWorld animals.
That is a very good argument. You know, because they are genetic hybrids from Iceland versus the southern residents, you know, they're mixed, they're from different oceans, they're from different populations. Any results from a scientific study on those animals really can't be directly applied to these animals in the wild. That's a perfectly decent argument. There are probably some counter arguments to it, but they, you know, would be desperate efforts to counter your argument. I'm not saying, you know, purebred is a weird term. It's not really the appropriate term to use, but yeah, you need to be studying the same genetic population, individuals from the same genetic population, I would argue. Yeah, I mean, you know, you don't want to, you know, it'd be like, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but it would be a bit like trying to use red wolf results to apply to gray wolves or vice versa. I mean, those are two different species, so it's a bit of an exaggeration, but you still don't even want to use different subspecies or ecotypes, as we call them in orcas. You know, you don't want to use different ecotypes, and you certainly don't want to use hybrids for any data you intend to apply to wild animals. I would agree with that. However, let me just say, you know, just apropos of nothing, that you might want to stop arguing with those people. It's pointless. You know, if they want to argue with you, they're trolls, and they're not going to listen to you. What you want to do is talk to the people who don't have an opinion yet. You want to raise public awareness amongst a great number of human beings who haven't even thought about this from one moment to the next. That's what you want to be concentrating your efforts on. You have only a finite amount of energy, and you do not want to waste that energy on people who are never going to agree with you.
Just one quick last. Abu Dhabi SeaWorld supposedly has no captive animals except one walrus. Do you know anything about that and what got them there?
Where, what, sorry?
Abu Dhabi that just opened.
Oh, yes, Abu Dhabi just opened.
Has immersive exhibits but nothing live except one walrus.
Well, the walrus, well, it should be two, actually, is Smooshy, isn't it? Five. There's 5 walruses, 2 of whom are from marine land of Canada. Why? Who knows? But I have to tell you, anywhere was better than Marineland, even Abu Dhabi. Other questions, yeah.
I always struggle knowing where is the line. I know life is not black and white, and there's a huge scale of.
No pun intended.
But, like in Mexico, there's so little money that goes to research, And I'm not a researcher, I'm an educator, but I've been invited a few times to projects with researchers where the money comes from the dolphinarium. And
Yes.
I've always said no, because for me that money is stained with blood and death. But then I know sometimes there's no other ways to do those projects which can help the wild animals. But I would like to hear your opinion, like where's the line, like
I think that's for everybody to draw for themselves. There are people who will say never. I will never take money from X. Ingrid just raised her hand. There are others who would say, well, if I think the answer will really, really help the animals, I'll take this money. And then there's others who are simply biased as all get out and will take anybody's money. To a certain extent, depending on exactly how bad they are, we call those people biostitutes.
Naomi's Kelly, by the way.
I know it is. Hi, Kelly.
I'll help you later. Hey, so on that thought, this is one I have struggled with forever, is that, okay, they have made billions of dollars from the southern resident killer whales. Over 50 whales have died, billions of dollars. Don't they owe billions of dollars to the southern resident population?
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think they owe some good proportion of their, global profits over the years to the conservation, protection, recovery of the animals they started with, which is the southern residents.
80,000 for this little self.
Yeah, and what they did instead, and this is very interesting. So part of the deal with the Humane Society of the United States in 2016, which was after I left, so don't blame me. This was my former boss who made this deal, but part of that deal was giving more significant money to help wild orcas, specifically to help free-ranging orcas. And we did a calculation to show what that meant. It meant leaving, the analogy is how much of a tip are you leaving on a $100 meal? So initially they were leaving less than 0.01% of their income on a $100 meal. Less than 0.01 cent. So then they went up to, I think, 0.1 cent, and then they finally, went up to 10 cents on a $100 meal tip 10 cents. And then what they went to when they did that deal with Humane Society was 70 cents. Yeah, so they should be leaving what, 70, but well, let's say they're just big tippers, are gonna leave 25, they should be leaving $25 for a $100 meal, and they ain't. So yeah, couldn't agree more.
They said that, stupid milk study was for the southern residents.
They also claim that their artificial insemination work is going to help free-ranging cetaceans. How you ever artificially inseminate some female in the wild, I'd like to see that. Particularly in orca, but even vaquita, how are you going to stick that baster up there? I don't know. You're not going to train a free-ranging cetacean to tolerate that kind of behavior. The whole point is they're wild and they're supposed to remain wild, so you're not going to be training them to do anything. Certainly not to tolerate artificial insemination.
I just wanted to agree with you on the Free Willy effect.
Yeah, why don't we have the Free Willy effect?
Exactly. Just an anecdote here. When we were fighting the Vancouver Aquarium, and they had orcas, belugas, and Pacific white-sided dolphins at the time. Now they have nothing. Nobody. No anyways, but back then, the producers of the Free Willy movie contacted us in Vancouver before the movie came to Vancouver. So So we contacted the 5 movie theaters that were going to play it, and they allowed us to put booths in each of the movie theaters inside, and so people would walk into the movie and some of them would sign. By the time they got out of the movie, everybody would be signing petitions. And that's really how we became the hotbed of anti-whale captivity in Vancouver. It was Free Willy movie.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and again, even if you were one of the people who raised their hand as having seen Free Willy when you were younger than 15 and don't think it really influenced you at all, don't discount that. Subliminal influence is a real thing.
I just wanted to point out that Kelly actually worked on Free Willy too.
1, 2, and 3.
I did some consulting with 1 as well, but yeah, that was way early in my career. You may not know this, but originally when the script was written, it had Willie being the harem male of his group, because that's what they thought it was. The fact that they understood he was actually the son of the matriarch and it was his family, his direct blood family. That was me! That was the only contribution I made. Thank you very much.
Later I'm going to talk about that, so I'll sneak this one in now. So one of the other things they wanted to do is when they approached SeaWorld to say, hey, we've got this movie idea, because the Walkers came and spent time with us here back when they were writing it, was that they actually were approaching SeaWorld and they said, oh, we'd love to work with you. If you could just change the ending.
Oh, yeah.
And it just that they rescued him from a really bad tank to a better tank at SeaWorld.
And fortunately, the Donners were actually really big animal people, and they didn't even for a moment entertain that. Also, just since we're in anecdote mode, and I'm almost out of my time, so I'm just going to throw this one out there. When they did Finding Dory, when Pixar did Finding Dory, the original ending was that all of the Finding Dory animals, all of the cohort of friends in that movie, were going to find a safe haven at a SeaWorld-like marine park. Blackfish effect moment here. So then, because they do this periodically at Pixar and probably a few other studios, they sometimes watch some hot movie and just see what's going on. They watched, what?
They went to Sundance and watched it.
Yeah, they watched Blackfish. Several members of the Pixar team watched Blackfish. And they immediately changed the ending to what it was, which was they all went back into the wild. All right? So, Blackfish effect. Immediate. Like before the movie was even really big.
And to circle around to what Katie was saying, there were also SeaWorld representatives in the audience who watched the same movie and thought it would have no effect.
No effect at all.
Pixar invited Gabriella to screen the movie at Pixar so they could rework their whole film at the cost
That's
of
exactly right.
$100 to them, and SeaWorld decided to do nothing. Seeing the movie at Big
So there it goes back to Katie's point of, boy, they did not handle this well. All right, I'm done.